So I sent out a tweet the other day asking people what topics they wanted me to bring up with Sam and I to discuss, and one of them was the definition of God. And I have a definition that I've been working on, and it has to do with this hierarchy of value. And it's based on the idea that you have to make a statement of faith in order to start any discussion, because you have to stop the questions. You can always ask the question why. No matter what you're saying, you can ask why. And that's no good, because at some point you have to stop asking why and act. And what that means is you have to put a stake in the ground somewhere and say, this is what I live or die by, something like that. And I think that what God is, from a psychological perspective, is the most fundamental place that you put your stake in the ground. And that's sort of a variant of Carl Jung's idea. He had many ideas about divinity and about the idea of God, but one of them was that God for you was whatever the highest value in your value system. God was the highest value in your value system. And that could be something conscious or unconscious, because you can have a conscious value system, which means you've thought it out. And everyone has a partially conscious value system. But your value system can be unconscious as well, in large part, because what the hell do you know about yourself? You're really, really complicated. You can't even set the clock on your microwave, and you're super complicated. And you act out a value system, and that value system is a hierarchy, and there's something at the top of the hierarchy, and you serve that whether you know it or not. And you might say, well, that's not equivalent to God, but it's not a bad psychological equivalent, and it's a pretty damn good start. And so that's the sort of thing that, I know that's kind of oblique, but that's the sort of domain that I want to investigate tonight. So, see, one of the things okay, so let's start with a set of propositions. So here's the propositions as I've been working them out in this tour. It's something like this: it's that you're tasked to action in life. It's not optional. Well, it is. You can just do nothing and degenerate and die painfully, right? But that's part of being tasked. That's part of being tasked to action, and it's part of what I mean by that is that the consequences of not acting in the world properly, let's say, is that you suffer and die. And you can say, well, that's okay, I'll accept that and I won't act and I'll suffer and die. It's like, fine, but that's the price you pay for not acting. Now, you might be willing to pay that price, and you might say, well, I'm not compelled to act because of that. But generally speaking, yes, you are, because it's not pleasant to starve to death, and it's not pleasant to die of thirst, and it's not pleasant just to sit and do nothing. Like, there's a strong impulse to move out into the world and to live, but not only to live, but to thrive. And you could say, well, in some sense, that's built into you. And so the impetus to action is there from the beginning. That's why I think in the biblical stories, for example, I did some biblical lectures last year, about 15 of them, and I spent quite a bit of time studying the Abrahamic stories. And one of the constant narrative themes in the Abrahamic stories is that there's a call to adventure on the part of the protagonist. It's God calls to Abraham in the most classic case and says, get away from your comfort, get away from your family, get away from your tribe, get away from your country, get out into the world and have an adventure. And it's not have an easy life, it's not be happy, it's none of that. It's get out there and contend. And in the Abrahamic case, it's extremely interesting because Abraham is quite old when the call comes. I think he's 80. Of course, the biblical patriarchs in principle lived far longer. Whatever, but he's 80. He's still old. He's been hanging around the house for too long. And, he gets called out into the world, and, it's God that calls him out, whatever that means. And you'd think if it's God calling you out that you'd step out the door and it'd be like, petals of roses would drop from the sky and everything would be wonderful, but that isn't what happens at all. I mean, Abraham's initial adventures are just catastrophic. He first encounters a famine, and none of us have ever encountered a famine. I mean, maybe there's a person or two in this room that has, but most of you have never even been hungry once, much less encountered a famine. A famine is a big deal, right? And then he goes to Egypt, and it's a tyranny, and people are conspiring to steal his wife, and it's just not good. And I'm sure he's thinking all the time, I should have just stayed at home in my tent, But it doesn't matter, because the call to adventure is there. And I think that's really useful. I think it's useful because it's also a way of conceptualizing your life. It's like, well, what is your life? It's not easy, that's for sure. It's certainly not something that you're going to be destined to be happy with. It's certainly got its tragic elements. It's characterized by malevolence and betrayal and all sorts of terrible things apart from tragedy. But one thing you could say is it might be an adventure. And maybe it's in the adventure that it's actually justified. And I think that's the underlying idea of those stories, is to be called out into the world, is to find an adventure that justifies the catastrophe. It's something like that. And that doesn't mean it's going to be easy or positive even, but it might mean that it's a worthy battle. It might mean something like that. And I've often thought that about marriage too. It's like when you marry someone, well, you should marry someone you want to contend with. There's another narrative trope in the Old Testament too. I think it's Isaac, if I remember correctly. Is it Isaac who wrestles with the angel? It's Jacob. Thank you. It's Jacob that wrestles with the angel. So what does that mean? Well, reality is something that you wrestle with, right? It's something that pushes you to your limit. And if you have a good relationship with someone, there's that in it. You want a worthy contender, And it's not all peace and lightness, not at all. And you'd be unhappy with that anyways. You'd go look for trouble if that was the case. If everything was just too good, it's like, no, I'm out of here. I need some trouble. It's like so back to the value idea. You have to go out and you have to pursue something. You can't just sit there and deteriorate away. You're compelled out into life. And so then what's the consequence of being compelled out into life? Is you have to do something worthwhile. Well, do you have to? It's like, well, actually, yes. Yes, you have to. It's inevitable. And here's the reason, as far as I can tell. There's a very large number of things that you could do, right? You could say in some sense that there's innumerable things that you could do. There's so many you can't count them. And so then, well, how do you choose between them? Well, part of the answer to that is things choose you, which is a complicated thing that I won't go into. Like maybe you're interested in something. And you think, well, I'm interested in it. It's like, not exactly. No, the interest is manifesting itself in you. You don't have much voluntary control over that. You know what that's like. If you're interested in something, you can pursue it, you can study it, you can read about it, you can remember it, you can work on it, and you can really work on it without having to beat yourself up about it. It'll just grip you and pull you along. But it's really hard to make yourself interested in something. If you're not, and you've had this experience no doubt when you were studying or when you were doing a job you didn't want to do. It's like, you have to do the job. It's necessary to do the job. You know it's necessary to do the job, but that doesn't make you interested in it. And you might ask, well, why not? Wouldn't it be just simpler if you could just tell yourself, well, this has to be done, and so I should be interested in it, and poof, you were interested in it, and then away you went. But that doesn't work. And that's not a non-trivial fact, man. This is part of the secret of the psychoanalysts. See, the psychoanalysts, Freud and Jung in particular, they've figured out that you are not master in your own house. There are things going on inside you that are autonomous. They have their own way of manifesting themselves. And they're not just simple. They're not just simple drives like hunger or thirst or the desire for sexual gratification. They're way more complicated than that. I like to think about them as sub-personalities, and they grip you all the time. And the fact that you can be interested in something, even despite yourself, because sometimes you're interested in things you know you shouldn't be interested in, right? And everyone laughs because they go, yeah, of course, that's right. This happens all the time. Yeah, and then you can't control that either. You think, geez, I wish I wasn't interested in that, but I sure am. Right, so, well, that's all an indication that there are things going on inside you that well, in some sense aren't you, but in a less, what would you call it, a less dramatic sense, at least you don't control. And they're not random. I mean, random just makes you walk stupidly off the stage and die, They're not random, they're directed. So there's something that's impelling you out into the world. And then when you're out in the world, you have all these choices to make. And perhaps a near infinite number of choices. It's the case technically that you can take a small number of entities like books and you can classify those entities a near infinite number of ways. So and that's just an indication of how complex the world is. So how might you classify books? Well, how thick they are, how heavy they are, how old they are, how old the paper is, how thick the paper is, how many E's there are, how many E's there are in the first sentence, how many A's there are in the first chapter, right? Number of 3-letter words, number of 4-letter words, number of 10-letter words, number of sentences, number of clauses. Well, you get the point, right? It's like you think, well, why would you classify books that way? It's like, look, fair enough, man. I didn't say that there would be any utility in classifying them that way. So you don't, but you could. So then the question is, well, why do you classify books in the tiny, limited number of ways that you actually classify them? Maybe by author or by topic. And the answer to that is because there's utility in that classification. And the reason there's utility is because it serves some value. If you want to find a book in the library, it works out that if you classify them by author, that's one way of finding them, or perhaps by topic. And so the manner in which the books manifest themselves in a classification system is dependent to some degree on the purpose that you're going to put the books to. Now that's something worth thinking about, because what that means, what it seems to mean is you're surrounded by an array of facts, like infinite number of facts. And you have to select from among those facts which ones you're going to act on. And the way that you select them is by valuing certain things. And so what that means, as far as I can tell, is that you see the world through a structure of value. So, and I mean that, I don't mean that metaphorically, although I also mean it metaphorically. I mean, actually, you see the world through a value system. It's the a priori structure that determines what in the world manifests itself to you.